refrigerator blindness. Any of the men have that here? You know, your wife says, go get the mayonnaise from the refrigerator, and you go in there and you look, and there's no mayonnaise in here. She walks over, reaches right over, and behind the ketchup is the mayonnaise somewhere. I mean, there are things that are very obvious to some and not to others. You see, there are some things that are hidden right in front of us, but we don't see them. And in fact, this is a holiday about that very thing. You see this image of sweet basil herb. It's a plant, and it's a beautiful plant. This one is doing really well. As you can see, the leaves are bright and green and deep, and it's growing just wonderfully. Except if you look carefully at it, you'll notice that there are some parts of the leaves that are kind of been chewed out a little bit, and they're actually something is eating this plant. Now, if you look closer, then you can see that where the leaves have been eaten out. You look closer, it still looks like an amazingly healthy plant. But again, something is eating this plant. That's not obvious, is it? Well, let me help you out. Let's look a little closer. Can you see what's there? Here's the leg. Here's another leg. Here's a couple of more legs, a couple of antennas, and the rest of the body. You know what? If I take that away, if you're looking at all of this, this thing is hidden right in front of us, isn't it? Take another look. Hidden right in front of us, and we easily miss it. You see, Purim is the reason we're celebrating and here today to celebrate and wear all these things. And it comes from the word pur, which is a Hebrew word that means a lot or a die or something that you cast. A singular plural is purim, which means dies or lots. And the question that you might ask is, well, we heard about the story of Purim, but what are we doing wearing these costumes? Why are we wearing these costumes? And you know what? It's interesting because the research on this in terms of what the rabbinic community has said, does that it look itchy? Yeah, it is. The rabbinic community has a number of different opinions here, as you might expect, but in an article that was sent, a link that was sent to me by Melanie, one suggestion is that it's because we hide in these things in order to remain hidden, because the holiday is actually a story of hiddenness. And it really, since we know that God, this is the only book of the Bible that God is nowhere mentioned, it is a situation where clearly the story doesn't reveal him specifically, but you see the effects that he brings about. So God himself is hidden in this story. And I want to just review some of that. We've heard the story today. I'm not going to go through the whole story with you, but unfortunately, right? The whole Megillah, in the congregations, in the synagogues, the whole Megillah is read. That's where the phrase comes from. And it takes hours to read through that, depending if you read it in Hebrew, and it takes a while. But the story takes place in Shushan Purim. Let me show you where that is. Here's a map of the Persian Empire from about 500 BCE. And over here on the middle right, you see a place called Susa on the map, which is actually Shushan. And so that's where it occurred. And today's map, this is pretty up to date, But actually, I'm going to tell you something here in a moment. Even this is a little bit out. Shushan would be right about there in what is now called Iran. And just to locate you, here is where Israel is. And you can see where that is relative to Israel. But there is an error. Well, I say there's an error on this map because I'm one day ahead of what will probably change. If you look up here, you see a place called Crimea, which is shown to be the property of Ukraine. And beginning tomorrow, it'll probably not be that anymore. But anyway, we're aware of that. Purim, we just heard the story. So we all know the story. But did we see the hidden hand of God in the story? And that's what I want to look at briefly with you today. I know everybody is looking forward to getting to the oneg. So we can just close in prayer and call it a day. I thought it would be worthwhile to take just a few moments to look at the hidden hand of God in this, the visible results of a hidden hand of God. It's like looking at a well-manicured garden and never seeing the gardener. You know that he's there, you know that he's been there because the lawn is mowed, the bushes are trimmed, the trees are everything's been fertilized, the flowers are looking beautiful and watered and everything, but you don't see the gardener. This is something similar. Here we are going to see how God worked, and I'm going to try, this is a little bit of a challenge to you. I want you to think about this because I'm going to be presenting some of the obvious things that happened with the king and Haman involved, and then I'm going to compare that with some things that happened in the lives of Mordecai and Esther. And you will see perhaps even more clearly that you may not have even thought of. There are some really remarkable things that have happened that when you read the story, you kind of get lost in the result and the marvelous miracle of God providing all these things. But we may be missing quite a bit in there, and there really is a lot. For example, we start out with a king deciding to have a big party at the beginning. Well, if you think about it, at the very end of the story, what does Mordecai have? Calls for a big party. The party that the king called at the beginning was only a hint of what was to come. At the beginning, the king calls on his queen Vashti to come and dance for him. He calls on Vashti. She refuses to come, but in the story, Mordecai is the one who ends up calling on Esther. He goes to her and asks her to do something for the Jewish people. Haman gets promoted in the story. I don't know if you know, it's not until chapter 3 in the book of Esther that you even hear about Haman. And in chapter 3, he's mentioned all of a sudden, and the king says, and he promoted him to be second in command. We don't know quite what for, but he is promoted. Well, in this, further on, we find out Esther is selected and then promoted to be even above him. In the story, the king is almost killed. Did you know that? Overlook that. The two guards at the gate who were planning to kill him, the plan was found out, and they checked into it, and sure enough, somebody actually got to the bottom of it. Can you imagine? I better not get too political here. The king was almost killed. But did you realize that Mordecai was almost killed as well? He was almost killed by Haman when he refused to bow down. And remember whose command it was to bow down? Anybody remember? It wasn't Haman. It was the king's command to bow down to Mordecai, to Haman. It was the king's command to bow down to Haman. But when Mordecai refused to do it, Haman could have had him put to death. But he had another plan. Now the king demanded everybody to bow to Haman, but later in the story, when the situation presents itself, Mordecai says, because he's a Jew, he bows only to God. How about that for bravery? Haman asked the king to kill all the Jews. We know that. That was his goal. It wasn't enough just to kill Mordecai who wouldn't bow down. He wants to kill them all. But Mordecai asked Esther to ask that same king to protect all the Jews. Interesting how that twist goes on. Now, how was that working out? After the initial plan is set and the king sits down with Haman to have a drink. They're going to celebrate, and they sit down to have a feast. On the other hand, it's Esther who asks all the Jews to fast. So you see the way things are working in one area and how some other things are working behind the scenes. Haman prepares a gallows, of course, for Mordecai. He does that because of what? Well, the suggestion that his wife made. I'm not going to touch that line. And he builds this gallows for Mordecai, and then he delights in that because he now is going to take advantage of that. He builds that gallows and prepares it for Mordecai. Meanwhile, Esther prepares a banquet for the king and Haman. Haman comes to the king asking him for permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he's just built. He shows up the following morning, and the king says, "You know what? I'm glad you're here, Haman. I'd like you to go honor Mordecai. But I was just going to ask you for permission to hang this guy." Interesting how that turned around. Haman thinks when he's invited to the banquets, not one but two banquets, he thinks that he's being honored, that Esther is honoring him to invite him to the banquets. She says, "Oh, that's great. Listen, I'll tell my wife and children, I've been invited by the queen. Oh, I'm a big shot." And it's at that banquet that Esther reveals how Haman has dishonored the king and all the Jews, including her. We find Haman getting overflowing with anger. He's bursting with anger because this one Jew won't bow down to him. You remember? He's so angry at that one example. But before the story ends, it is Haman who is bowing before Esther, the Jew. Haman begs Esther for his life. And in the very process of begging Esther and pulling at her and pleading with her, the king walks in and thinks that he's attacking Esther and condemns him to death for doing that very thing. Haman ends up getting Mordecai's gallows. Yes. I don't think he expected that. And of course, Mordecai ends up getting Haman's home. Yes. Haman had received the king's ring at the beginning when he was elevated to be second in command. Remember that? How the king gave him his signet ring and said, "Make any laws you want. Here's my ring, you can stamp it with it." And at the end of the story, the ring that was on Haman's finger is now given to Mordecai. Mordecai receives that very ring. Haman's plan is to destroy all the Jews, but there's a hand working behind all of this. And it ends up, the command that is put forth by Mordecai, who was elevated to second in command in place of Haman, gives a command to destroy all the enemies of the Jews. There were no doubt many who were delighted with the plan to destroy all these Jews in the empire. And by the way, if you look at the extent of the empire that Ahasuerus controlled during that time frame, it included all the area where the Jewish people would have lived, including the area of Israel itself. Had they been able to follow through on the command to kill all the Jews that were in their empire, that probably would have been just about all the Jews in the world at that time. The 13th of Adar, according to Haman's plan, was a date that the Jews feared for their lives. What was going to happen on Adar 13th? Remember? The date that all these enemies were going to attack the Jews. That was the date, the 13th of Adar. But instead, it became a date where the Jews themselves were feared by many in the land. Why? Because one of them had become second in command. All of a sudden, a Jew was second in command to the king. What does that say about his people? You know what? I think I'm going to switch teams. How is that? How the plan for evil that God used for good. Haman's plan to annihilate all the Jews, and this is the final comment about, in a sense, the irony of God, the way God worked through these. Because all of these things on the left-hand side that you see, all of these things are things that were looking pretty bad for the most part. And they ended up being pretty good. Haman's plan to annihilate all the Jews, how did that turn out? Do you remember at the end? Many became Jews. How about that? He didn't only not succeed in annihilating them, they ended up increasing in number. Thank you, Haman. He meant it for evil, but God used it for good. A theme that echoes throughout the Bible. Joseph shared with his brothers. How many times in Scripture we see that very thing. And we think about Purim, a story about hiddenness, all these things that are going on that you never hear God mentioned, yet you see his handiwork. You see his hand taking all of these negatives and turning them to positives in the story. You know he's involved, you know he's there, but you do not see him. It's hiddenness. In this case, God's hand was completely hidden, not even mentioned in the story. But what about our lives? See, this is where I want us to take the story of Purim this morning. What about our own lives? What is hidden? What is hidden in our lives? If we stop and really take a look at it and we're honest with ourselves, we probably have more than a few somewhat destructive habits that we get involved with on a regular basis. There are patterns in the way we respond to people or to situations, patterns of response that have been going on for a long time. And every time the situation presents itself, we respond in the same way. There are subtle choices that we continue to make which really may not be the best for us. And we kind of know that, but we continue to choose to make those choices. See, some of the opportunities that are in front of us, we may not even see at all because they might be camouflaged. And in the process of making our decisions, we're not spotting these as opportunities. Instead, we're seeing them as like landmines to be avoided. And God keeps putting these things in front of you, and you keep thinking to yourself, why is he doing this? Here we are again, the same kind of problem. It's easy to miss because they're camouflaged, and we overlook them. Why? Because we want to in some cases. We just don't want to see what's going on in these situations that we're handling. Some of them have been going on for many decades of our lives. Failure to respond appropriately to those things in your life may be consuming your effectiveness. You may think about these things as difficulties, suitcases in the aisles, I call them, but maybe God keeps putting them there because you didn't catch the lesson from the last one. Is that a possibility? And how can we recognize these? If this is the case, what can we do to recognize these things? The first thing we have to do is we have to be intentional about looking for them. We have to stop blinding our own eyes and saying, you know what? This is what I do when this happens. This is the way I handle it. I've always done it this way. That's what I'm going to do again. And the same situation comes up in our lives. We do the same thing. Did you ever stop and think that maybe God is, it's like Groundhog Day, right? It keeps coming back. You keep getting a chance. It's not, it's the Sonny and Cher song, keeps playing every morning, and you're not getting it. In order to break that rhythm, that habit, we must practice looking in order to see. We have to be intentional about it. We have to practice that. We have to work at it. There are destructive, I call these things that are in our lives that we're not handling well. These are like destructive little critters that are eating away at our lives. Even our fruitfulness as believers, we wonder why we're not more fruitful. And we keep doing the same wrong things and missing the opportunity, seeing the problems as difficulties instead of opportunities. Are you hearing me? Are you hearing that? Because that's really a lot of us, and I've done this myself, so I'm speaking from experience here. I'm part of the problem here. But once we recognize them, we can begin to address them if we stop and recognize them and face them and say, this is what I always do here. I never seem to make this a priority, but I always seem to do that. I know I could do that, but I never do it. I'm always over here doing this. If you recognize those and start thinking about them originally, you'll see them as opportunities. In order to address them, you have to really see them. Take a closer look at what's going on, and you may be surprised. You may be surprised because what's hidden right in front of us are the explanation for the problems. Are we willing to see them? Or are we just standing back at our lives and closing our eyes to it, not looking carefully? We got little critters in your flower bed there. And it's not necessarily your spouse that's got the problem. Some of you, I know, my spouse is always pointing these out to me. No, not true. It's always easier for the other one to see them. What's hard to do is to respond appropriately when somebody points out the problem. Usually what happens, you know what happens when somebody points that out? Get lost. Right? I don't want to hear it. Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, right? We're just in denial. And I think of you, Mike, when I say that. It's not a river in Egypt either, denial. I'm just joking with Mike. He's always good at these things. But let's, each of us this morning, as we celebrate Purim, just remember the hiddenness of the story and what's hidden in your life. That's between you and the Lord, and maybe some others in your family see it, and you've been denying it all along. The question you have to face is, what am I going to do about it that's different than what I have been doing?